Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome back to another session of Hanafi Fiqh. Today we're going to be looking at wiping over socks and casts. So wiping over khuffs is permitted for men and women whether resident or travelling. So there's no condition on when you can wipe and who can wipe. Men and women can wipe whether you're resident at a place or travelling. It's a dispensation from Allah's kindness to us. It's a dispensation from Allah, the lawgiver, for us as an act of kindness. Some of the reasons why you'd wipe over your socks would be in winter, right? In areas, in pre-modern societies, people didn't have the luxury of centrally heated houses and even hot water. And there was a very real danger sometimes of getting frostbite or getting really sick. So in issues like that, if you have the ablution, you can wipe over your socks. While traveling, obviously ease in traveling. Again, in traditional societies, when they used to travel on camelback or horseback or on donkey, it's not easy. Travel is a form of hardship, and it's not easy to loosen up your riding clothes, because riders used to have an extra garment that they used to wear to protect themselves from the elements and from the animal itself. The sweat of the animal and the smell of the animal. And in instances like that, it's not always easy to undress. So wiping is an option there. At work, in today's age, it may not always be appropriate to put your foot in the sink in front of everybody. It could be a cause of embarrassment. So it's very discreet and quick to wipe over your sock. When you're sick, as mentioned before, if there's a chance that your sickness can get worse, or if you haven't got the strength to wash your feet, if you're in a state of wudu prior and you've wore your khuffs from prior, then you can wipe over them again. When the time of prayer is close to ending. So when is this? So let's say I've only got 5 minutes left to pray, and I just realized, oh my God, time's running out, and I rush to the bathroom. It takes me 3 minutes to do wudu, and now I know that I don't have enough time left to pray. So in an instance like this, I could make my wudu, again, assuming that prior to this I had wudu and I put my socks on. We'll discuss this later on. So I make my wudu and I can wipe over my socks, thus saving the time of washing my feet and then quickly go and quickly pray. However, in all instances, these instances here, washing feet is superior, and there are some instances that are beyond the scope of this course where it would actually be superior to wipe on the khuff. But in all instances here, it's always superior to wipe over your feet. When I say wipe over your feet, I mean to wash. What is a khuff? Khuff comes from the word khafif, something light. So a khuff could be made from leather. Traditionally, they were made from leather, or it could be a thick sock from a material, a coarse, thick material. And traditionally, khuffs, you could take them off. Like you'd have your riding shoes on, you'd have your riding boots on, and then when you dismount and set up camp, people would take off their shoes, and then they'd keep their khuffs on, and then they'd walk around in their khuffs doing their everyday evening duties, preparing the meal, washing the dishes, pitching tent. It was something that was sturdy and stable. It served a purpose. So in today's age, the closest thing to that would be a leather sock, would be sports socks, sealskin socks, football socks, thick socks. Not the thin socks that you wear underneath a suit, those smart, elegant, thin socks where they're almost transparent if looked upon from above, and then if you were to put water on them, the water would penetrate straight away. So you must prevent water from reaching the skin. So let's take the example of an everyday sock that everybody wears, that smart sock that you wear underneath your trousers or your jeans. Now, if this was my foot, if I look at my foot, I can see through to the skin. So then that I would not be able to wipe over a sock like that. Secondly, if I didn't see the skin, it was a little bit thicker, and if I wiped over it, would I feel the moistness straight away? If I felt the moistness straight away, then it's not fit for purpose. I need to wipe, and if after a while, after say 10-15 minutes, I were to feel the moistness, or even after a few minutes, if I were to feel the moistness, that's different, right? But as long as I don't feel the moistness straight away, and again, thick socks, sports socks, football socks, hiking socks fulfill that purpose. You can wipe and you wouldn't feel the moistness. I mean, simple wiping, you wouldn't feel the moistness anyway. But even if you were to put drops on those socks, you wouldn't feel the moistness until at least much later. So it needs to also stay on your foot without tying. It mentions here walk extensively without tearing. As I mentioned, sports socks and hiking socks are built for exactly these purposes, and these have been tested many times over. You can walk for miles in them without wearing a shoe, and they wouldn't rip. Whereas technically even a normal sock, I think they've been tested as well. You can get away with walking miles in a normal sock as well, but a normal sock doesn't fulfill the other conditions. We're talking about thick socks. At least 3 Arab miles. And it must stay on your foot without tying, so that you mustn't have laces or anything there. It supports itself. And hiking socks, they have elastic and contracting fibers built into the socks. Obviously, it's like a snug fit. They hold themselves. You don't need to additionally tie them. So they fit the purpose. Again, leather socks fit the purpose as well. And you cannot have done tayammum. So for example, if I did tayammum and then I decide to put the leather sock on, and then on the next prayer time think, okay, I'll just wipe, make wudu and wipe. No, that can't work. Because if I am making wudu, that means water is available. So in that instance, my tayammum would no longer last anyway, right? I'd have to make wudu and then wash my feet and then put the socks on. Must cover both ankles. So if this is the foot, say this is the foot, this is the toe, the heel underneath here, and then you've got the ankle bone. Where the ankle bone is slightly above the ankle bone, that's the ending of the foot. So it can cover here, as some socks do. Sports socks are longer, it can cover here, but the ankle bone needs to be covered. It doesn't matter if it's loose. Like a leather sock would be loose, you'd be able to see the ankle on both sides, all around, you'd see everything, right? But that's not what's taken into account. It's basically if your foot was flat on the ground, would the sock come above your ankle bone? That's what we're talking about. And the foot should remain inside the sock. It's not a case of it's very loose where your foot comes out. If your foot comes out, then if you're not in a state of wudu at that time, then you've invalidated the use of the sock, which is like a fortress, a shield around you. You basically, the idea is that filth is able to penetrate now. Right, the sock is not doing its job because it's come off. If you're in a state of wudu, that's different. You can take it on and off, and we'll mention that as we go along. And it's not a condition to be waterproof. As I mentioned, it doesn't need to be waterproof as long as it's thick enough that if you were to wipe, water doesn't go through it. And obviously, you can't be in a state of major impurity. If you're in a state of major impurity, then you need to have the ghusl before you can perform wudu and then wipe over your socks. The hoof must cover both ankles, even if made out of juh, very thick material. So whatever applies for one foot applies for the second foot as well. 2 socks, 2 ankles. In order to be able to wipe on khuffs, one must have completed wudu before its invalidation. However, it's not a condition to complete wudu before wearing the khuff. That is, if one were to wash his 2 feet, wear the khuffs and then complete his wudu, then it is valid to wipe on the khuffs afterwards. So what does this mean? Now this means that, let's say for some strange reason, we've got George here, and George decides to make wudu, but he decides to make wudu backwards. So instead of washing his mouth and his nose, he decides to wash his feet first, right? So George has washed his foot, put the khuff on, washed his other foot, put the khuff on, and then carried on, right? And he's worked backwards now until he finally gets to his mouth. He's actually worked backwards. Is his wudu complete? Yes, it is. Is that the appropriate way to do wudu? No, but his wudu is technically complete, right? But what about to be able to wipe on your khuffs? Can he now, if he breaks his wudu, right, and then make a second wudu, correctly or incorrectly, but make a second wudu and wipe over his khuffs now? Can he? Because remember, he didn't finish his wudu. He only just washed his feet and put it on, right? The answer is yes, he can, because it's not a condition that you complete your wudu, right? As long as you have started your wudu. So George here could have washed his nose, then washed his mouth, then washed his foot, then washed his arm, then washed his face, then washed the other foot, right? And then done the mas right at the end. So in this condition, again, the same principle applies, right? He's put his khuff on each time he's washed that limb. So in an instance like this, once his wudu is complete, if he breaks his wudu, then yes, he can still wipe, even though the khuffs went on before the wudu was technically finished. And A condition is that you must have wudu before wiping. So if I get up in the morning thinking, okay, I'm going to pray Fajr now and I'm getting late for work, so I get dressed, put my socks on, then I head into the washroom, make my wudu, and then wipe my socks thinking I'm going to pray Fajr in this. No, you can't do this. You have to have made a full wudu first, a full wudu with the washing of your feet, then put the Hoofs on, and then when you invalidate your wudu and make a second wudu, then you can wipe. It's not a condition to have ablution before wearing them, we just mentioned that. Resident and a traveller. Now, if one is residing somewhere, not on a journey, he may wipe his hoofs for 1 day and 1 night. That's 24 hours. The way it's looked at is by hours. So keep your mind towards the numbers I'm going to give now. 24 hours. If someone is residing somewhere, not on a journey, what does this mean? A resident is somebody who lives in a particular place. So he's always there. Or somebody who's traveling. So he stops somewhere for 3 days. Right? He's still considered a traveller. You know, if his mind is that I'm gonna stop here and I'm gonna return back. So he's considered a traveller up to that period. So if he's a resident somewhere, so if I make my mind that I'm gonna go to another town, right, and it's day 3 now, but I know that I wasn't gonna come back, so I don't have to wait for the 15 days. Now we're gonna discuss in the section of prayer on the prayer of a traveller and what is a traveller and what is a resident. But at this point, all we need to know is a resident and a traveller. So if you're a traveller, if you're a resident, it's 24 hours that you can wipe for. And if you're a traveller, it's 72 hours. That is 3 complete days and nights. 72 hours, right? So you have 3 days to wipe, basically. And a traveller is someone who has travelled, I've read 48 miles and 50 miles. Right? It's around 50 miles. So a traveller is somebody who's travelled around 50 miles. So this time period during which one may wipe on hoofs begins from the time his wudu is invalidated after having worn them in a state of ritual purity. So let's have a look at this. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. So when to wipe on hoofs? So here's a scenario. George makes his wudu at the time of Fajr, 6 a.m. He wears his hoofs at 6:30. So half an hour after doing his wudu, he wears his hoofs. And then he loses his wudu at 11 o'clock. And then he makes wudu for Dhuhr, to pray Dhuhr at 1 p.m. Right? So at what point does the 24-hour cycle start for him? Does it start at 6? Well, obviously it can't start at 6 in the morning because he hasn't got his hoofs on. He put his hoofs on at 6:30. So does it start from 6:30? Or does it start from when he lost his wudu? Or does it start from when he made his wudu again? So the correct answer would be from the time he lost his wudu. So he made his wudu at 6 o'clock. At 6:30 he put his hoofs on. So even though he's got his hoofs on at 6:30 now, the 24-hour cycle, the clock doesn't start at 6:30. It starts at 11 a.m. when he broke his wudu. So regardless of whether he made fresh wudu at 1 p.m., as in wiping over his hoofs when it came to washing his feet, his time starts from when he broke wudu. So 11 a.m. till the next day. So the whole day, and then 11 p.m. that's the whole night, till 11 a.m. the next day. That 24-hour cycle, that's his period. It's a 24-hour period starting from the time he broke his wudu. Starting from the time you break your wudu is the time where your clock starts. So if you've held your wudu for 12 hours, you made wudu 12 hours ago and you held your wudu for 12 hours, and then you broke your wudu, you invalidated your wudu, your cycle would start at the 12 hours. At that 12-hour point where you broke your wudu. Okay? So if the time for wearing the hoofs is expired, so let's say now the next day has come. The next day has come and it's now 11 o'clock, right? And he happens to be in wudu because again, he's made his wudu again. Let's say he woke up for Fajr and he made his wudu and he happens to keep this wudu till 11 o'clock. Now his 24-hour period was finishing at 11 o'clock. So what happens is after that 24-hour period goes over, after it hits 11 o'clock, he needs to now, he's the purpose of wearing the khuffs is now become null and void. So he needs to take his khuffs off and just wash his feet, providing he's in wudu. If he's not in wudu, then obviously he needs to make a complete ablution and then put his khuffs on. But providing he's in wudu, after that 24-hour period finishes at 11 o'clock, all he needs to do is take his khuffs off, wash his feet and put his khuffs back on again. Right? Because we're only concerned with the khuff, we're not concerned with the rest of his wudu. It's there. We're only concerned with renewing the 24 cycle of the khuff. Now in between that, let's say somebody has wudu. And this is a scenario that I've definitely done many times in my life. Let's say that you are in a state of wudu and you take your khuffs off for whatever reason. So George again makes wudu at 6 a.m. But during that time he didn't put his khuffs on until 9 o'clock. And then at 9:30 he felt a severe itch. He took his khuffs completely off and he didn't put his khuffs back on till 11 o'clock. That's 2 hours now. And then he puts them on. Providing he still has his wudu, you can take them on and off and there's not a problem. But if he broke his wudu and you happen to take your khuffs off, then obviously you've broken the cycle as well of putting your socks off. What if you're a resident who becomes a traveler? This is an interesting one now. Now, we mentioned that being a resident is 24 hours and being a traveler is 3 days. Now, in this particular instance, George is a resident for 12 hours and then he becomes a traveler, having traveled 50 miles. So at that point, even though George was a resident, his cycle started from when he broke his wudu. So he has to now, when he arrives at his destination, he becomes a traveler. Automatically, when he goes past the 50 miles, he becomes a traveler. So he needs to basically look at, now the minute he's a traveler, the ruling for the 72 hours applies on him. But he's already worn the socks for a particular period before, when he was not a traveler, when he was a resident. So in this example here, George wore his socks for 12 hours, right? Out of the 24-hour period, he broke his wudu and it's become now 12 hours. He has 12 hours remaining, right? 60 hours equals 72. So George has, in this instance, 60 hours left, right? Take away the 12 from the 72, because now he's a traveler. That gives him 60 hours. So he has 60 hours left now. Now, if George were to return back home, and then again, if he's a traveler, but he's returned back home now, the new ruling, when he returns back to his house and he's no longer a traveler, the ruling of being a resident applies. So the 24-hour cycle. And then what he would have to do is look at his prior hours when he was traveling. Is it more than the 24 hours or less than the 24 hours? So he may need to add or subtract hours depending on what he's done, what his travel times were. So it's the reverse of the traveler. The minimum requirement area that must be wiped is the surface of the person's 3 smallest fingers. So these are my, well, technically not this one, right? This is the longest finger. So these 3 are my smallest fingers, 1, 2, and then the index finger. So the surface area of these 3 fingers, right? Just to make it easy, I'll just do this. The surface area of your 3 smallest fingers is the area you need to wipe. So for example, if this is my foot, if I've done that, that's enough, right? We normally we'll wipe more whenever we do wipe, but the minimum area has to be 3 of the smallest fingers need to have wiped. And wipe here, technically in fiqh terminology, wiping here is touching. Touching is enough. As we mentioned before in water getting into the hijab of a woman, touching is sufficient. Now the area that must be wiped is the top of the hoof. So if this is the foot again, it would be from the toe and the top up to the bone. It wouldn't be the sides and it would not be the underside. We're only looking at the top. So 3 fingers worth of the top. Now holes. What if I've got a hole on the hoof? Now remember, the purpose of the hoof is to keep water out, right? So what if I've got a hole on my foot? Well, if I've got a hole, let's say I've got a hole here, and the hole is like the size of a penny. Right, that doesn't matter, even if the hole was on the bottom. And as long as the hole isn't the size of 3 of your smallest toes. So the size of 3 of your smallest toes, that's actually quite a big space. So as long as it's not the size of 3 of the smallest toes, we don't take it into consideration. Now what if I've got a hole here, the size of a penny, then I've got another hole here and a third hole here. right? That's 3 holes. Then in this instance, we add up the holes and we look at how big they are. If they add up to the size of 3 toes, then you cannot use those khuffs. Anything under 3 toes, you can carry on using them. Doesn't matter how many holes you have. Now each foot is looked at separately, right? So we don't look at all these holes and then equate them with this one. No, this is a separate sock and this is a separate sock. Both feet are counted separately. If hole or rip is on the toes, consider any 3 of the big toes. Okay, this one's interesting. So let's say that I've got the rip, I've got a substantial rip on my toes. Now in the case of my toes, I can consider any toes to make up the 3 toes. Why am I saying this? Is because if we look at the big toe, now that's actually quite large. It takes up 2 toes. It takes up 2 toes. And if I put the big toe and then the second toe next to it, it's roughly half the foot now. These 2 toes are the size of the last 3 toes. So if in a situation like this and the hole or the rip or the tear is on the toe area, then you can add up any 3 toes that would equate the size. So it's probably easy to add up just the last 3 toes again and see how big that hole is, even if it's at the front. So the hoofs must be free from holes. Again, this is the chart of it's a summary of what we just spoke about. So if you've got a tear in your hoofs, if it's less than 3 small toes, you could wipe. If it's more than 3 small toes, you cannot wipe. Now the extent of 3 fingers is obligatory, right? So again, say these 3 fingers, if I just touch them on the top part, because it's also obligatory to wipe the top part, and it's done, right? So for argument's sake, if I just use these 3 fingers and I went like that, it's done. That's the obligatory element done. Now I've wiped my sock. And it has to be the top. Now the sunnah method is to begin at the toes and to spread your hand. So obviously if that is the obligatory element, the sunnah element would be, if this is my foot, then I would get my hand, I would spread my fingers and I would wipe from the toe up to the ankle. That's the sunnah method, right? To do a complete wiping. You'd wipe to the ankle and the shin area. The following things invalidate the wiping of the hoofs. Anything that invalidates wudu. So basically anything that can invalidate your wudu, like passing gas or going to the toilet, etc., will invalidate your wiping also. So if you need to make wudu again, then you'd have to obviously wipe your foot by default if you're in your hoofs. Taking the hoofs off. So if you're out of wudu and you take your hoof off, your hoof is like a fortress. It's been described as a fortress, as a shield that covers you from filth. It serves a purpose in and with itself. So if you are out of ablution, if you were in ablution and you wore the hoof, you're protected. You're protected from external filth. And even though you have invalidated your wudu, your protection still remains. You just make a fresh wudu and wipe over it. But if you've invalidated your wudu and then you take the hoof off, then now you've exposed yourself to filth, so to speak. So then you would need to then make a fresh wudu and then wipe over them. If, however, you're in wudu, then you take them off, put them back on. That's not taken into consideration. The expiration of the time period, unless one fears harm to his feet due to extreme cold. So again, this is the case of George making wudu at 11 o'clock and then the next day at 10:59. That's the last minute where he can make a wudu and wipe. If it goes over that period, now he needs to take his foot off, wash his feet. He has wudu, he takes his foot off, washes his feet and puts his feet back on. So 11:01, he's put his socks back on again, and now again the cycle starts again for another 24 hours. Unless one fears harm to himself due to extreme cold. This would be in, again, minus temperatures. If you're out hiking in the wilderness somewhere or up in the mountains, and you'd fear for your limb, you'd fear frostbite or extreme hardship when you're wearing winter clothing and it's not easy to take off the outer garments, right? Fur skins and everything. Due to extreme cold, in an instance like this, you would wipe. And then it takes on the meaning of like a cast here, or like a bandage even. Most of the foot leaving the hoof or becomes wet Now, most of the foot, so the foot, if this is the foot up to the ankle, most of the foot would be 50% of the foot, right? So 50% or more leaves, then that's considered exiting. You're no longer in the protective state now. So you need to then make a fresh wudu, wash your feet, and then put the hoof on. Or again, if it becomes wet, if your foot becomes wet, if most of your foot becomes wet, then again you need to make a full wudu and then wash your feet and then put the hoof back on. It's not valid to wipe on a turban, cap, face, veil or gloves. So this ruling is only for wiping over footgear. We don't apply the same ruling. We don't take this ruling and apply the same ruling and say, okay, it's okay to wipe over my turban, wipe over my hat, a face veil or gloves or the like. It's exclusive for the footgear only. And here is a good example. I'm mentioning this is because this is what I use myself. It's actually very good. Sealskin socks. You can search this on the internet. Sealskin is a company that produces socks. It's got 2 layers and a waterproof layer of rubber in between. So even if you get the outside layer wet, it would not penetrate through the inside. It's a very sturdy sock, very comfortable sock. They're originally hiking socks, but they serve the purpose for wiping beautifully. They're excellent socks, and I would recommend everybody have those socks. And on a last note, if you're wearing a sock consisting of 2 or 3 materials, if one of the materials happens to rip, we don't take that into consideration, because then you have a second material that's still complete. Now, following on from this, casts or bandages. If one has a broken or wounded limb, he may wipe on its cast, bandage or dressing for as long as the excuse remains, even if it was placed on the limb while the person was in a state of minor or major ritual impurity. So an example here would be a broken arm. If I were to have a broken arm and I'd be in a cast here, right? And I'd have a solid cast here that I could no longer bend my arm even. It's impossible for me to take it off or to get water underneath it. Indeed, if I did get water underneath it, then it would probably fester and the skin underneath and become infected, because there would be no circulation and it's probably start rot. So in this instant, I would wipe. Right? Wiping is sufficient. Even if it was a soft bandage, the wound underneath, there's no problem with me taking the bandage off and being able to wash the wound. Wash the wound. If I can successfully wash the wound, then washing, you have to wash. Because not every wound needs to be covered. Even though I'm covering it temporarily, sometimes wounds can take water. It will not cause a difference. If I can't wash it, then I must wipe the wound, at least wipe the wound. If I can't wipe the wound, if it's really that bad that I can't wash, I can't wipe, then obviously I'm wearing the bandage, then I would wipe over the bandage. But in the instance where I'm able to get to the wound and wipe it or wash it, then I must do. So if it's a case of where I can never be able to get the bandage off myself and then put it back on myself, then obviously in that situation, I would prefer wiping. You'd wipe. Even if you're in a state of major ritual impurity, this basically means that if you're in need of a ghusl, you're in need of a bath, and then you break your arm, or then you get the injury and someone puts a cast on you or a bandage on you, then you're not obliged, if you can't, you're not obliged to basically open up that bandage and then have the complete ritual ablution, getting the water here, and then obviously then take into consideration that you have a cast, and then when it comes to wudu, then you wipe. No, you wouldn't do that if it entails causing further damage to yourself. What you would do is you'd do the ghusl, and whatever you can wash, you'd wash, and whatever you can't wash, in this instance the arm, right, then you would wipe the arm. It is not a condition to wipe the entire cast, although it is according to the weaker opinion. Okay, so it's not a condition to wipe the entire cast. What this means here is, as for the sake of wudu, you have to wash the entire limb, right? But when it comes to wiping, we don't need to wash the entire cast. So if the cast, let's say I had a cast or a bandage that was covering from here to here, right? Making sure that I'm wiping the entire cast, every part of the cast, would mean that I'd start to rub and do stuff like this, which could further cause problems to the area that's in need of nursing, or could damage the cast. So it's not a condition that you wipe the entire area. It's basically a wiping, so then you can wipe and it's done. Right? There's no need to be scrubbing for everything and causing hardship on yourself. A simple wipe like this would be sufficient. It is also not necessary to wash the exposed skin in between the wrapping of the dressing. Some casts
bandages, when they're wrapped around you, they leave areas of exposed skin. So I could have a bandage here, and I could have a piece of skin showing here, a piece of skin showing here, and a piece of skin showing here, because the bandage isn't wrapped around tight enough. In that instance, I don't need to wipe this part and then wash this part, and then wipe this part and wash this part. No, I would just basically wipe over the entire cast, entire bandage, like it's one. And if it's not possible to wipe even the bandage, then don't do anything. So if I suffer from a disease, a skin disease, where, God forbid, where my whole body breaks out in blisters and sores, and I become super sensitive, where it's sometimes even impossible to wear clothes, and they have to try their best to bandage you up, and your skin's super sensitive where you can't even touch the bandages. In that instant, then I would not even do that. I would do nothing. Or I've got a fresh wound that really hurts, painkillers haven't kicked in, and even touching the area would really, really cause me agony and further exasperate the problem. If the cast or bandage falls off, then neither the earlier wiping nor the ritual prayer, if he is in the middle of one, is invalidated, unless the limb is already healed. So in this instance, if I've made the ablution and I've got a bandage here, complete bandage or a cast, and I've wiped it, because I couldn't wash it, I've wiped it. Now after half an hour the bandage falls off, or I need to change the dressing. In this instance, if I put a new dressing on it, do I need to then again make wudu and wipe? No. The previous wiping for the previous dressing would suffice for this one. However, if my wound is healed, so if I've seen now that when the cast has come off, that my wound no longer exists, that means now I have to make a wudu and wash the part now, because it's completely healed. If a new cast or bandage is placed on the wounded limb, it's not necessary to wipe it again if wiped previously. We just mentioned this. It is, however, recommended to do so. There is no intention required for wiping the cast or the leather sock or a normal sock, a thick normal sock. So with wudu, again, there's no conditions. It's not tayammum, it's like regular washing, wiping. There is no intention needed for this. So that's it for today. Thank you very much. Walhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.